Thank you. Good evening, everyone. We're here continuing to work with In Divine Friendship, and we'll start after a prayer with a little bit of chanting from Keshava, 2 chants, and then a few minutes of meditation, and then we'll start with our discussion. So let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow at thy feet. Guide us with your words, with your ever-living presence, with your omnipresent love, that we may be inspired to live in this world in constant remembrance of our relationship to you and your unconditional love for us. Help us to live as your instruments, to uplift and to share with others as you have uplifted and shared your love with us. Om. Peace. Amen.
Today my mind has dived deep in thee. Today my mind has dived deep in thee. For thy pearls of love from thy depthless sea. For thy pearls of love from thy depthless sea. Today my mind has dived deep in thee. If I find not, I will not blame thy sea. I will find fault with thine diving. Today my mind has dived deep in thee. Today my mind has dived deep in thee. For thy pearls of love from thy depthless sea. For thy pearls of love from thy depthless sea. Today my mind has dived deep in thee. If I find not, I will not blame thy sea. I will find fault with my diving. Today my mind has dived deep in thee. Today my mind has dived deep in thee. For thy pearls of love from thy depthless sea. For thy pearls of love from thy depthless sea. Today my mind has dived deep in thee. If I find not, I will not blame thy sea. I will find fault with my diving. Today my mind has dived deep in thee. Today my mind has dived deep in thee. For thy pearls of love sea, for thy pearls of love from thy depthless sea. Today my mind has dived deep in thee. If I find naught, I will not blame thy sea. I will find fault with thy diving. I will find fault with my diving. I will find fault with my diving. Let nothing disturb you, nothing affright you. All things will pass, but God changes not. Patient endurance brings you to victory. Once you have God, you'll want nothing more. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. Let nothing disturb you, nothing affright you. All things will pass, but God changes not. Patient endurance brings you to victory. Once you have God, you'll want nothing more. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. Let nothing disturb you, nothing affright you. All things will pass, but God changes not. Patient endurance brings you to victory. Once you have God, you'll want nothing more. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. Let nothing disturb you, nothing affright you. All things will pass, but God changes not. Patient endurance brings you to victory. Once you have God, you'll want nothing more. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. Let nothing disturb you, nothing affright you. All things will pass, but God changes not. Patient endurance brings you to victory. Once you have God, you'll want nothing more. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need. God alone, God alone, God alone's all we ever need.
Om peace. Okay, here we are. We are still in this giant section of the book, which is called Ananda, which is going to go on for, I noticed, 25 more pages. So, settle in. And it's full of surprises. We'll just see where it goes next. A lot of this, as someone referred to it, as a history lesson. It's very interesting when I'm a founding member of Ananda, and I recognize that I have an old people's affection for my own life experiences. And I have this feeling that other people care. So I hope you can always fast forward if you're watching it on a recording. I'll do my best to keep it relevant. But of course, to my mind, a lot of things that happened with Swami seem really relevant. They formed a lot of Ananda's point of view about various things. And so it's a little hard. I'll just have to do my best and hope that you don't mind. So you may recall, or if you haven't, you can look at the last class. There was this long letter, there were excerpts from a very long letter that Swami wrote in 1998 at the end of, wait, where am I? Yes. Just a second. I didn't put the right notes in here, so I just want to make sure. Yes, it's right. It's about how Swamiji was talking about the dangers of over-centralization in an institution, and he used the Ramakrishna Order in a very uncomplimentary way to talk about what can happen, how institutionalized an organization can come. And I told you last week that what's coming next is, in response to objections from one of Sri Ramakrishna's disciples about what Swami wrote in that letter. Because the letter, which was originally written to all of Ananda, but it was just to our own mailing list, and the way that things were starting to work in 1998, it was posted on the internet, so then it became viewable by anybody in the world. And some of Ramakrishna's disciples strongly objected to what Swami had written because it was so uncomplimentary. So Swami writes, quite simply, "You are right." And it's sort of just like right at the beginning. He just says, "You're right." And I'm appalled that I let those statements go out on the internet. I mean, this is just, again, this is what Swami happened. Somebody wrote to him and said, "What you did was really not right." He said, "You're right. I'm appalled I let it happen." No effort. Now you'll see he says a lot more, but when he's wrong and when somebody makes a good point, Swami doesn't start by justifying himself. He doesn't start by explaining. He says later, "I'm not trying to justify, I'm just explaining," which is he will in a few paragraphs. But he starts by saying, "You're right. I'm appalled that this happened." It's just, it's such an obvious way to respond, and it's a very good example. My letter was written for our own devotees and was, I think, important as a clarification for our own directions. Later, I thought of the internet as perhaps the only way to get through to SRF people who might eventually change the direction of their activities. So in other words, he's beginning to explain, this is what happened. I wrote it to our people. Then I thought, well, this could also be salutary for SRF members. Swami had this constant desire where he wanted to communicate to the Self-Realization Fellowship members in the hope that they would see his point and then speak to their own board of directors. Because by this point, 98, Swami had pretty much given hope of communicating to the board of directors, but he hoped that the members themselves could say, this is not what we want. So that was his thinking. Later, I thought of so on as to change their activities. I will check with certain people at Ananda to get their opinions on whether to omit the letter altogether from the internet or to revise it in certain respects as you have suggested. Swami's also holding his own position. You're right, I'm appalled that this happened. This is what I was thinking. Now I'm going to try to figure out what to do. So he also doesn't throw himself on the mercy of the court here, because Swamiji believed what he wrote, and it was thoughtful, and to a large extent it was also true, if unflattering, but it was also true. So Swami's really giving us a very interesting sort of story here about how you handle it when you're criticized. What's true and what's not, how far do you go? Truthfully, I was thinking historically and not diplomatically. nor taking into account the fact that there are indeed, as you say, good monks in the Ramakrishna Order in America today. And yes, you are right also in saying that Yogananda was careful not to speak out against people publicly. Once again, there it is. My own guru said not to do this. You pointed it out to me, and you were right. The other side of the coin is that we have been litigated against for nearly 9 years with no sign yet of a let-up. I myself have been persecuted by SRF for more than 36 years. I held my tongue until they sued me, at which point it became necessary for me to defend myself and Ananda. So Swami also, he didn't mince words. He wasn't afraid to just stand up and say it. And so he did. You're right, I'm appalled I let it go out. But the fact of the matter is that what I said was also important. And so just because somebody objects does not mean he's going to back down from an uncomfortable truth. The insights in my paper regarding decentralization were important for us, and the examples from history, particularly from Sri Ramakrishna's successors, were virtually essential for making my point, though I'd like at least to make clear that my reference is not to the present generation of monks in America. So he's sort of trying to play it both ways, Swami is here. Moreover, many sincere and wonderful disciples of Ramakrishna have come up in recent years, especially outside the Ramakrishna mission. He's still not really letting them off the hook. He's just sort of saying it like, what I said was true. He's never been one, Swami's never been one to shy away from an uncomfortable truth, especially in matters of religious institutionalism. And Ramakrishna himself used the analogy of a lamp which casts a shadow directly underneath it, but shines brightly at a distance. So it's very interesting. So he's also, and I have to say, he must have felt that there was sincerity in this letter, and therefore it was worth explaining. It was worth sort of telling whoever wrote to him, look, you also have to be honest about your institution. There may be good monks in it, but that doesn't mean that what I said wasn't true. And also he's trying to encourage them to, take a different direction if they can. Because SRF has made such an issue of being the only true representatives of Yogananda's legacy, the public has come to understand that legacy in institutional and philosophically narrow terms, very different from what he clearly expressed both privately and in public during his lifetime. So my paper may be important for others besides our own followers, and the lawsuits have forced me to be relentlessly clear as to our true mission. This is a battle that Swamiji, I wrote about this a lot in Lightbearer. When I wrote Lightbearer, when I started really, really focusing in on what that book was supposed to be, I did not want to write in that book so much about the persecution of SRF. I really didn't, because, why would I want to do that? Swami was gone, Dayamata was gone, most of the main players were already passed from this world. I really didn't want to. The book is chronological, 40 years with Swami. It starts in 1969 to 71. The first chapter covers several years. All the other chapters are 1 year at a time. So I write 69 to 71. I arrive at Ananda, all this happens. In November of 1972, Swami is leaving Ananda to go on a trip to India. It's extraordinarily important to him because he hasn't been in India for 10 years, because he hasn't been allowed to go back, because when he was expelled from SRF in 1962, word was passed on to the Indian government that Swami was an undesirable because he was a CIA agent and a Christian missionary in disguise. So for 10 years he couldn't get a visa, so he could never go back to India, which prevented him from going to India and just going into seclusion. That made him basically stuck in America, which is how Ananda happened, and on and on. So I'm in the second chapter of this book about Swami, and I can't explain November of 1972 without going back to July of 1962, when Swami was expelled from SRF. And mean, literally, in my seclusion, I said, "Oh, sir, really? Do we really have to do this?" And basically he said, "How are you going to write my life story without it?" So I said, "Okay." And, then it's a thread all the way through. But the fact of the matter is, one of the things that Swami was focused on to the end of his life was the creeping danger of religious institutionalism, which invaded, his home turf because of this difference of opinion between the disciples who were in charge of SRF at that time and his point of view. And many of us at Ananda just felt like, who cares? I mean, I really said to him, "Sir, who cares? Like, we're doing fine. What difference does it make?" Swami said, "I'm thinking of generations, Asha. I'm not thinking of the present." He said, "Christianity was one entity for 300 years. I mean, this is dividing in the first generation." He said, "Look at all the horrors that have been enacted because of that split." And then he wrote in a place called Ananda, which now has another name, something to do with institutions and individuals. I don't think it's a print book, but it's an e-book from Crystal Clarity. It's a wonderful book to read. It's the most personal story that Swami tells anywhere. It's much more personal than his autobiography. But in it he says, basically, the fight between institutional authority and individual inspiration, he said, is a classic ongoing fight in religion. And it happened in Christianity, and it was the Gnostics versus the institutional church. And the Gnostics were defeated. So unless you know something about it, you don't even know that they existed because they were obliterated. And institutional Christianity took over. The Gnostics some of them were, as Swami said, not really quite center. The Gnostics was a very wide spectrum. But essentially Gnosticism was the same dispute that we were in, which is spiritual authority a matter of individual attunement, or is it institutional? Is it passed down generationally through an institution, or does it rise up spontaneously in the heart of any devotee who is attuned? So, good question, isn't it? And Swami said, quite frankly, he said, there's no certainty in Master's work which side of it will really prevail. And when I read that, I really realized, I was just being naive. I don't understand these things the way Swami does. So here, even when he's wanting to be humble, and you have a good point, you're right, I shouldn't have written like that, but you see, I had to. So he's telling us both things at the same time. He this is typical Swamiji, which is he doesn't just tell you what he did, he tells you why he did it. And the point of that is, then you will be able to think, a person is able to think more subtly about the principles involved. And when you understand the principles involved, when the next situation arises, where the facts are completely different, but the principles are the same, then you can think about things in terms of principle. So he's explaining what he's up against and how important what he's up against is, and how the history of the Ramakrishna Order illustrates the point. Even if you, as a Ramakrishna devotee, don't want to believe it, Swami's not going to back down from the point. He says it's just the truth. Even Ramakrishna said, the shade casts a shadow, and the light is brighter when you're a little farther away. A prophet is without honor in his own home. In another class I was doing about Christianity, I read the part where Jesus goes to Nazareth and reads from the scroll about, the coming Messiah, and then says in the synagogue, I am what this scripture is talking about. You're just carpenter Joseph's son. We've known you ever since you were a child. How can you be the subject of this? And they cast him out of their synagogue. And Jesus says, prophet is without honor in his own home. And that's among many things from the Bible that's what people say. That Ramakrishna says, there's a shadow under the lampshade, and the light is brighter when you're at a distance. So, Swami then goes on to say, I am old now. He lived another he lived another almost 20 years. I am old now, and don't know how much time I'm to be given to finish what I have to do. He lived 15 years. I speak clearly because I want to leave behind me a legacy of understanding, not of vagueness and confusion. So Swami is also saying, I know I may ruffle a few feathers and offend a few people, but I need to leave a legacy of understanding, not of vagueness and confusion. So sometimes when Swami would do things that seemed, and the word sometimes you might want to think of as impolite, I would always think about, I wonder why he would feel justified. And that's what he's saying. Yes, this might have been impolite, but I have to leave a clear legacy. And this letter, Ananda's Directions, 1998, was a huge, huge, important epistle from him, because it was after the absolute worst of that litigation. The litigation like sort of was resurrected by this long appeal that remanded certain small issues. But 98 was really the culmination of it. So all this is only to explain what I've done, Swami says, not necessarily to justify it, just to explain it. You don't have to agree that I'm justified. In fact, Swami himself was explaining it and not yet justifying it. If in discussing the paper with others here, the feeling is to change or even withdraw what I've written from further public scrutiny, I'm perfectly willing that happen. I try my best to be fair and kind, and certainly don't want to offend anyone unnecessarily. Moreover, what you wrote was definitely the advice my guru often gave, and the example he, like your own guru, always showed. This was interesting because many times in the course of those litigation years, Swami would draw us all into the conversation, even if he had a strong point of view. Or sometimes he really didn't know. There was just so many different ways it could have gone. And of course, I deal with that in Light Bearer much more, where it could have gone this way, it could have gone that way. He would on multiple occasions from Palo Alto and from other colonies, we had to all gather. Swami would just say, I need you to come and hear and think. And then we'd talk through, because Swami didn't know how much longer he would have, and all of us were going to have to live with whatever the legacy was he created. So he needed to make sure that we at least understood, and he had great respect for our point of view. It wasn't just lip service. And then sometimes, as I've explained in other places, Swami had a strong intuition about what should be done, but he was never presumptuous, and he would open the discussion to see if we could bring up points that he hadn't considered, or if he would hear in something we were saying something that he felt was a compelling message from Master. And in that sense, he also set an example. So that's what he's saying here. This isn't entirely my decision. If others feel strongly, I'll go along with them. But I have to converse. I can't just say yes or no here. So thank you for writing. Whether I withdraw the letter or delete certain parts or explain them further depends on many factors which will have to be considered carefully. But I deeply appreciate your writing as you did. You were right to do so. So it's very nice. Somebody defended their own path and their own master, and Swami approved. But he said, I'm not sure what I'm going to do about it. And this again, I mean, that's why this section is called Ananda. There's so much in here, which I've mostly covered, but I just want to highlight it again. How do you deal with it when people criticize you? And so many people just think, oh, especially nowadays, if I'm criticized, I just have to run around and agree. And I have to throw myself, as I was saying, on the mercy of the court. I just have to mea culpa about everything. No, actually you don't. Sometimes you just have to say, I'm weighing all the factors, and I'll stand by what I've done, and I'll take the heat for it. You know, peace at any price is not necessarily always Dharma, even though peace and harmony is a good idea. And Swami also really wanted whoever wrote this letter to know that he entirely approved of the criticism and that it was absolutely right. I mean, I don't know who this person was, but Swamiji is a formidable spiritual teacher, and somebody just wrote and said, I think you were wrong for what you did. And he wanted to make sure that that person knew, you're correct. And apparently, because of the way Swami responded, they must have written in a very appropriate way also. So lots of fun in that one. Okay, so now we're into a wholly different subject. We're still in October, we're still in 1998. Now we're in the month of October. The manager of an Ananda East-West bookstore facing serious financial challenges wrote, "We are spread too thin. Maybe it would be better to do 10 things well rather than 40 things partially well." Now, Ananda Palo Alto has an East-West bookstore. There's one in Seattle. The Portland store is an independent bookstore, New Renaissance. So I don't know if there were more than two. Anyway, so I don't know if it was us. I don't know which side wrote this or when. So Swami writes, East-West Bookshop is a metaphysical bookstore that in the Palo Alto area. It was started by a woman named Virginia Sharfman, I think in the late 50s, at a time when the only way you could get spiritual information was through books, and there was no internet. And she single-handedly created this absolutely marvelous bookstore where you could just find books that you couldn't find anywhere else. When I lived in this area before I knew Ananda, like in 1964, 65, 66, all that period of time, we haunted East-West Bookstore because it was just such a marvelous resource. And when Virginia Sharfman grew elderly, she began actually to lose her eyesight about 1981. It was like her baby. She'd grown it up, and it was a real jewel. And she knew Swami Kriyananda because he would come in. His parents' house was just a couple of miles from where East-West Bookshop was, which was in Menlo Park then. And whenever Swami would come to the Bay Area, he'd always go in and visit with her and talk to her about his books, which he also sold, of course. And about 1981, she said, "I'm old. I need to retire. I'm losing my sight. Essentially, this is my child, and I don't want to give it to anyone. Would you buy it from me?" And Swami tells the story in terms of intuition, because it was not a real practical idea for us to buy it. We didn't have the money. We didn't have any experience running it. We didn't have a center in the area. We had one in San Francisco, but that was 45 miles away. 45 minutes, maybe 30 miles. But Swami intuitively felt the answer was yes, so he bought it. We bought it, and money came. Jacqueline and Vasudeva, who were living in San Francisco, moved to this area, and that was the beginning of having a community in Palo Alto, was the East-West Bookshop. They lived above the store for a while and then got a house, and the rest is history. 6 or 7 years later, I moved here, and everything started a new phase. So the end point of all of that is, oh yes, so it was a metaphysical bookstore in which all paths were equally represented. It was not like the bookstores we have in our churches, our sanghas, our teaching centers, where we concentrate on our work. Also, there were different readers and healers, like psychic readers and healers and other kinds of people, other kinds of services, and every valid spiritual path. We didn't carry anything dark. And on occasion, Swami thought that certain teachings were not appropriate. And we had speakers. So it was and is a slightly different ministry. It's parallel in keeping with Master's teaching, but it's not the same as what we do through our Ananda temple. In our area, it served us perfectly because of East-West, that's where we can feature everyone. And because we can feature everyone there, we can be more specific in our temple and not feel like we're being sectarian. But sometimes it would be a little much. And it was sometimes a discussion, especially when the store was largely staffed by Ananda devotees, which at different historical periods it's been more or less that way. Whether or not all that exposure was really what the Ananda devotees who worked there really wanted. So it's been an ongoing adventure. But East-West at this time, I mean now, all these years later, now it's in Mountain View, we moved it, has just been a tremendous positive service to the whole Bay Area, even with the internet, the on-site opportunity. It has a deeply spiritual vibration, and it's a temple in its own way, and it's been a wonderful asset. And Swami has always really favored it and appreciated why we've done it. So he says to this person, this is 1998 now, "Thank you for writing. And yes, I very much agree with you. At East West especially, we've suffered from lack of focus. I hope you'll be able to bring people to a focus and to more of a focus in our teachings. Less eclectic, less scattered, less into everything new, as though its very newness and popularity justified our getting wholeheartedly behind it because we think it will sell. I think our people would benefit from more focus, and so also will our customers and their interests in what we are doing." So this was a period in which Swami thought we'd gotten too broad in our focus, and I don't have clear, even though I would have been part of this conversation, I don't have clear insight to offer on the backstory there. "Did you know that the Hindu Way of Awakening is still the #1 bestseller at East West in blank, whichever the other one was? It's because they work harder at drawing people's attention to it. They display it prominently in the window, etc. The best one to consult on this subject would be blank, whose impression also has been that your store is too scattered. Too much variety, just too much." So there you are. "You mentioned the variety in my own work." Okay, let me just pull this together for a moment. "You mentioned the variety in my own work, and I don't mind your doing so." I suppose because this person is suggesting that we're spread too thin in too many ways. "You mentioned the variety in my own work, and I don't mind your doing so. But 2 points ought to be kept in mind. 1, everything I've done has had the ulterior motive of furthering Master's ray, which is to say, it's not as diverse as you think it is." Maybe they were trying either to get him, the implication here is that Swami himself is spread too thin. And that has been a complaint. That was a complaint at the time by the people who were trying to sell his books. This book is on the Hindu Way of Awakening, and this one is on supportive leadership, and you've written it under the name of Donald Walters. Swami was even using 2 names as the author during that period of time. He wrote the books that he said did not require an Eastern focus and might be hurt by an Eastern focus. He wanted to publish as Donald Walters. The Art of Supportive Leadership, probably Money Magnetism, Education for Life. Now, Hindu Way of Awakening is helped by being called Swami Kriyananda. But he thought the Art of Supportive Leadership would not be helped by being Swami Kriyananda. He thought it would be an unnecessary obstacle that would discourage its appropriate audience. So for the people working to publish and sell his books, which included the East-West bookstores, it was hard to figure, how do you get a consistent thread when the subject matter is so diverse? Most authors, John Grisham novels, for example, which I have occasionally used when I've had long airplane flights, and I sometimes enjoy them. They're always a John Grisham novel. You don't have any problem. You just know if you're going to get it, what you're going to get. When you pick up a Kriyananda book, you don't even know what you're going to get. It could be about children, it could be about Kriya Yoga. And so I don't know if that's how this person wrote, but I can see the implication. So he says, "You mentioned the variety in my own work, but first, it's all been to spread Master's teachings. It's just that Master's teachings are very broad. And everything I've done has been done with total focus." So he's trying to say the wide variety you see is not because I'm scattered and can't make up my own mind. It's that I know exactly what I'm doing, and this is what I'm going to concentrate on now. Swami could have said a lot more, but his role both when he was Master's son, when Master was the King of Spain, and when Swami was Master's son, when Master was the King of England, It was Swamiji, after the king's passing, that solidified the Master's mission, especially when Master was William and Swamiji was Henry. And that's, I feel, exactly what Swamiji has done this time, which is Master just laid out so many possibilities, and Swami just picked up each one of those threads and brought it to a much more clear and specific focus. But yes, it's a wide variety because it's an entire culture of self-realization. Swami just went through everything you do in life and said, if self-realization is the goal, and God is present in everything, and our responsibility is to be His instrument, how would you raise your children? How would you educate them? How would you meditate? How would you get money? How would you be an artist? And then he answered it very consistently. But yeah, it does look like there's just this whole vast range. But everything was because he was focused, and he was focused when he did it. He wasn't just scattershot around. The president of Warner Books commented, Warner Books, which at that time became Time Warner, the president of that company felt that Swami Kriyananda had the potential to become an international voice for the spiritual movement, and for a time, Warner Books, especially this president of that company at the time, really worked closely with Swamiji and with our publishing company to see if a partnership would work. It didn't, and there might even be a letter in here about what happened and why it didn't work. However, the president of Warner Books commented, "It looks like a great deal of variety, but I see, in fact, there's a wholeness in everything you've done." And one of our longtime members commented a few years ago, "Though sometimes I thought you were changing your approach constantly, I realize now that, in fact, you've always adhered to the central truths of Master's teachings. All you've done is try different ways of bringing those truths out." So now Swami's trying to, whoever this person he's writing to, he's trying to educate them that mere variety does not mean that we're spread too thin. And having a multidimensional approach is not the same as being scattered. Because the beginning was that East-West was a little too scattered and did lack focus, but it's not comparable to what Swamiji had done with the publishing of his books. It was a good point for you to bring up, but let me explain to you why it's not quite clear. See, this is what Swamiji did for us for so many years, and still does in all his writings, and I tried very hard to carry on in the book I wrote about him, which is, a lot of us were very bright. You know, we're bright people. We're the kind of people who are drawn to Ananda are bright and for the most part well-educated and creative thinking. I mean, that's just all of Krishna's soldiers look like Krishna. That's just who came. But Swamiji was another order of magnitude in the expansiveness and especially the crystal clarity of his understanding of things. And over and over and over again, either in personal conversations, in the lectures that he gave, in the letters he wrote to individuals or the letters he wrote to the whole community. And this is why Swami would be so, he would go through every step. You know, and sometimes, I mean, he was never in a hurry. He would just go through every step because he was really trying to train us how to think. And I would often go in thinking that I had an idea and that I wasn't wrong, I just hadn't finished because I just didn't have the energy or the imagination to know how to finish. Well, East-West has too much variety and there's too many different things going on here, but it's the same problem. Swami Kriyananda has the same problem with his writing. Well, superficially it may look like that. And with most of the people in the world, people would just say yes. But Swami would say, let's think this through. And then he would push us in a new direction. And it's just absolutely vitally important for the spiritual path. There's this line in the book Swami wrote called Money Magnetism, which was the theme of the morning broadcast I did for a couple of weeks here. And Swami includes in Money Magnetism, if I've said this before in this recording, forgive me, I lose track of which classes I've spoken about things in. 4 paragraphs that Swami called crystal clarity, just the concept of crystal clarity, which became an important theme. And then after that, he has the sentence, muddy thinking and feeling results in chaos. And that's like, I've always sort of known that, but I just like was so perfect. Muddy thinking, not wrong, just a little muddy. So you're justifying or you're pointing this and saying that, but it's not quite true. So let me explain to you why it's not quite true. Think a little deeper. Stand back and see it from a bigger perspective. Consider it from this angle. And I mean, myself, invaluable, absolutely invaluable. There's just, I can't even begin to say. Otherwise, I would still be lost in my own opinions. And we have to continue, even though Swami's presence isn't here, we have to continue together to be profoundly interested in what is true. And again, this is why I wrote Light Bearer the way I did, which is so much of Swami's reasoning and the way he thinks, not merely what he did, but why, on the level of principle, so that we can really try to understand those principles and then keep ourselves with divine attunement. The mere fact that Swami's out of the body makes communication a little more challenging, but it doesn't take it out of the picture at all. If we're sincerely wanting to know, he'll speak to you as clearly as he spoke when he was right in front of us, sometimes more clearly, because because we make ourselves receptive, then he can speak to us more clearly than if he's imposing the thought on us from the outside. So Swami writes, I have a kind of mind that can embrace many subjects and hold them together. Not many people can do that. So why ask them even to try? I've offered different avenues for them to take deeper according to their own inclinations. But nothing I've done has been scattered, either in concept or execution. I've thought about Swami's different books. It's partly in keeping with his idea that he wanted to make Ananda broad enough that every devotee who comes can find a meaningful way to serve. And we haven't really come to that stage of Ananda's development, but we will in the next generation or two, where someone will just, pick up one thread. Obviously, education for life is a clear example, or material success, or spiritual marriage. And we'll realize, I can make a whole life. I can make a whole life of service out of this one area of personal development, because you could, easily. And then with Swami's seminal writings, to sort of help launch our own intuition, I think that generations from now are going to be fascinating. Swami said that he says the day will come when Master's teachings will influence every area of society. He said not necessarily his name, but his teachings, which is sort of an interesting way to put it, which is that as the Yuga advances and culture shifts, it will begin to reflect, the principles that Master put forward. And I wrote, again, in the introduction to Light Bearer, that Swamiji has created an entire culture of self-realization. And then I add, right now no one cares, or very few people care, because we're, in fact, as a society, we're just racing in another direction. But that other direction is unsustainable and unfulfilling. And so whether society as a whole crashes or an individual reaches the end of that road, they will gradually over time discover Swami's work for Master, which is the same as discovering Master's work, but they'll just discover this practical expression. And society will be influenced. Swami said to the president of Warner Books, when that man said that he was going to make Swami very, world known, Swami said, I'm the kind of writer who becomes famous after he dies. And what that means is, I'm the kind of writer who's not in tune with the present, that what I'm writing is for the future. And I think that is really what's going to happen. I mean, the Swami himself said, why would I want to be in tune with this present? This is not something that I would want to push along. I'm writing for the advent of Dwapara Yuga when it comes. A very interesting factor just historically about this. Of course, William, starting England, Swami Kriyananda, among other things, he created the rule of law in England. He codified law in England. And of course that led to the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, and so on. And then that energy was moved over to America. Of course, the English system of law was moved over to America. And America became the Dwapara Yuga country, which enabled Master to start here in Los Angeles. I mean, all of this is all in a flow. And interestingly, when Master was Ferdinand III and Swami was Alfonso X in Spain, Alfonso X also created a system of law. That was one of the things that he did. That system of law came to the New World, which was the continent that became the USA, because Spain was a very strong influence all through the Southwest. And when it all became a country, the system of law that came from Alfonso from Spain to the New World ended up strongly influencing the way the American government was set up. The USA government was set up, and there is a portrait of Alfonso X in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. as a tribute for that. Now, you can see just how, I asked Swami, how long have we been doing this? And how much were the masters involved in the founding of America? With all of these interplays. All Swami said about that, I said, basically, did we found America? Did the masters found America? Were we here during that? And at that time, I was reading a lot about the American Revolution and felt this tremendous attunement with it. Now, I think I've been that kind of revolutionary, so I could feel attunement with it whether I was there or not. But I certainly felt like the founding of the USA was essential for Master's work in Dwapara Yuga. And if India and America are the leaders into Dwapara Yuga, you can see the whole thing. At the dinner table on a holiday somewhere, we were probably in Goa, all Swami said was, Asha thinks she was there at the American Revolution. What do you think the rest of you think? I hadn't actually put it that directly, but he never committed himself. He just raised it as a question. And naturally, many other people who are part of Ananda would feel in tune with that because we're revolutionaries by nature. Whether the revolution is spiritual or political is something else, but the kind of people, especially the founding generation, we were the children of the 60s. We were just stepping out and doing something different. Who's to say? But Swami's answering all of that. You may be scattered, but I'm not. I have the kind of mind that can hold lots of things and keep it clearly focused. Not everyone can do that, nor should you even ask them to. So he says, I support what you propose for East-West. That is, recognize our need for more focus, less skating over the surface, more enjoyment in just doing what we really believe, instead of working to promote all sorts of eclectic ideas. The more we do that, the greater will be our success financially, too. So at different times in the history of East-West, Swamiji has suggested we become more focused. And in the history of East-West since 1981, which is now 40 years, it's gone through a lot of different cycles. So by no means do I feel that the present iteration of it needs to be corrected. As I recall, there were a lot of things going on at this point, all of which were leading to very scattered energy. It wasn't just a question of who we sponsor and what books we sell. There was a lack of focus, which needed to be corrected. We've thought too big. There's a need also to think small. And I think we've reached a point at the store where more of the second is needed. That's what also happened when we get farther into Warner, and maybe Warner was part of this too. Swami said, we just, in trying to be big and important, sometimes we lose our true spirit, and we have to be true to our true spirit. So he says, we've thought too big. there's a need also to think small, which is just define our work in a way that inspires and gives us energy, and don't try to take on a dharma that doesn't really come from our hearts. That's always important. So, let's go. This is now, we're in the year 2000, and these letters aren't chronological, they're by subject, but this letter happens to be the year 2000. Responds to concern about plans to log certain areas of Ananda Village, making it too park-like. Now, where this came from is in 1998, at the end of that lawsuit, which was the character assassination lawsuit, when we had a big judgment against us, and also in the process of that lawsuit, the people who were opposing us learned more about our legal structure. They had thought that Ananda was one legal entity, and that by suing one aspect of Ananda, you were suing every aspect of Ananda. And the only thing we won in that lawsuit was that that wasn't true. And so the access that the plaintiffs in that suit against us won when they got a judgment was limited to the assets of Ananda Village. And Palo Alto especially looked like it really had huge assets. We do own our temple, which is a very valuable piece of property, but we lease our community. So our assets were not as big as our opponents thought they were, but it would still be more than just the assets of Ananda Village. So they refiled. They just started like 5 or 6 more lawsuits. Am I right about that? Or was it just one big one? Maybe 2 or 3? Immediately after that one, almost before that was went over, they filed a number of more lawsuits. And they sued a lot of us individually, and they sued at all the different Ananda entities. It was a nightmare. Basically, it was a nightmare. And the only thing that stops litigation is bankruptcy. Because if you have the resources, you can just drive someone into bankruptcy. Your case might not have any merit, but you can bankrupt your opponent. That's the other way you can win. And so we were also right at the edge of bankruptcy. Not every Ananda entity, but Ananda Village, with the judgment against it and with the never-ending litigation, which it appeared to be never-ending litigation. And, I was personally sued, and all the community leaders were personally sued. It was not looking good. So Ananda Village went into Chapter 11 at that point. It also went into Chapter 11 because it had to. We were out of money at that point. And that's why we never appealed that case. We were out of money, and we would have just had to have a retrial. We just collectively said, we're done. But in order to stop that litigation altogether, bankruptcy, Chapter 11 was required, and we were. And there we were, not really needing money and not really knowing what to do and being in a very difficult position because of the judgment. And then somebody realized that we had a tremendous asset. And we own 1,000 acres of land in Nevada County, and we'd never, let's put it in another way, we'd never harvested the timber, and also another way of saying is that we had never managed the forest, because you can manage a forest so the word logging is a terrible word, but not all logging is, to reduce the hills to nothing. You could manage the forest, and we could harvest a lot of valuable timber, which we did ultimately, and we did it very, very consciously with lots of ecological consultation and replanting, and the consensus, the honest consensus, if you were objective about it, was that it was a good thing to do, and it was God sent. It was a brilliant inspiration. I believe Vidura had it. Just suddenly looking out the window, he saw, hundreds of thousands, certainly tens of thousands of dollars just out the window. And so, however, there was a certain kerfuffle, as you can well imagine, because most of the people there were very ecologically conscious, very nature-oriented, and there were just lots of things. So there was a big kerfuffle about doing it and how to do it and whether to do it. And the first thing that was allowed was everybody got, there's another letter in here somewhere, but I don't think this is it. Everybody got to go out and mark their special friends. That's how it was called. You would make a big mark on your special tree friend and have it, taken out of consideration. You could save your favorite trees. And then I didn't live there at that time. I haven't lived in Ananda Village since 1986, but I was long gone, so I only heard this secondhand. But it was a kerfuffle. And so here's a letter from someone. I think I know who it was, but it was just people who were very... Swami is responding to concerns about plans to log certain areas of Ananda Village, making it too park-like. So Swami writes, I very much appreciated your letter about the tree cutting. See, when somebody writes a good letter, Swami says, I really appreciate the letter. I don't have to agree with you, but you wrote well. It's an important subject. You wrote well about it. That's what he said to the Ramakrishna people. It was a good letter. Thank you for writing it. You don't have to... Swami he always said, I much prefer an honest argument to a mindless yes. That's how he put it. It's like he didn't mind when you raised real points, especially when you raised them thoughtfully and sincerely. He didn't appreciate energy that was just oppositional, as we were talking about in earlier letters, that just kind of a knee-jerk no to anybody with authority. But if you wrote thoughtfully with honest and sincere concerns, he was always happy to discuss it with you. And, sincere people can disagree. We don't have to all be on the same side, but there's an appropriate way to express your point of view. I very much appreciated your letter about the tree cutting. I feel that the guidance you received was right. Lower forms of life don't work from ego and are not deeply concerned about themselves individually. Their karma, as Master said, is a group karma. There had been an earlier brouhaha when Swami himself cut down some trees at Crystal Hermitage in order to get a better view of the river. And there was a lot of energy about that one when that happened too. But Swami said, they're life forms, but they're lower life forms. They don't have as much individual concern for their continuation as human egos do. He said their karma, as Master said, is a group karma. Trees do have feelings, as Master indicated, but their feelings, much more than most people's, is for the general rightness of things and not for themselves particularly or for personal likes and dislikes. The general rightness of things, not for themselves particularly or for personal likes and dislikes. Swamiji told this story. Let's see, how did this go? This is like from 1968, when he first bought the property, which is still the meditation retreat. He said when they were first coming into it, some trees fell across the road, and Swami sort of felt that the forest itself was trying to keep them out. They'd had it all to themselves, and now he wanted to keep them out. He said several years later, when Seva was pulling her trailer out to move to Ayodhya, he said trees fell across the road again. And Swami said, and maybe it's fanciful, maybe it was not. He said he felt then that they were sorry to see her leave and were trying to keep her in. That they had also enjoyed her consciousness because she was very attuned and she had loved them. Now, I might have some of the details wrong, but that was essentially what he was saying. So he says here, they have feelings, but they want to do what's right. They don't have personal preferences like human beings do. Life and death are for them more or less meaningless, and death is not a cause for suffering. I mean, that's a very big statement when he's talking about trees. It's like, you have to, again, see, this is the way Swami would challenge us, because we would just assume that the cutting down of a tree was inherently a tragedy. But he said, not always. Depends on why it's cut and with what consciousness it's cut and what general good is going to be created by it. And we would want to, defend every tree, that they have a right to live just like we do. And Swami said, well, human beings have a different destiny than trees. This is a perfect example of how Swami would challenge us where we would just put out a thought that seemed so self-evidently correct and was backed by all of our youthful emotion and passion and, ideas about everything. And then he would just raise something quite contrary. Yes, they have feelings, but and then he would say something like, they're a lower life form. And then we'd have to go through all of Master's teachings about human life and other beings and group karma and the general rightness of things, and does a tree really care whether it lives or dies? It's just like, it was challenging. It was just much easier. It was much easier to just give a big emotional response and be able to just hold on to it. So I'd like to add a thought about your personal lack of interest in parks and your preference for natural wilderness, because that was also a big, we'll harvest the trees and we'll have more park-like forest. When some people, that just sounded like anathema. That was the last thing they wanted. Many of our problems in life arise from the way we define things. Thus, atheists reject their idea of God, but believe even passionately in love. Yet God is love. So, again, this is muddy thinking, false definitions. Everything follows from a false definition. I don't believe in God, I believe in love. Well, what's the difference? Well, I hadn't really thought of it like that. Your definition of modern parks may not please you. I seized on this as the simplest and most easily recognizable example. But I can't imagine someone as sensitive as you preferring chaos to coherence and coarseness to sensitivity and refinement. So isn't that interesting? He's complimenting. I think I know who this, I think it was a woman, and he was right. You're a very refined person. You wouldn't like chaos and confusion. Most of us love wilderness, though I think most people like at least to be able to walk through it. The vibrations of a place can be spectacularly uplifted when the place is developed, not with a view to destroying trees, but to make it beautiful and cared for. The very devas are attracted to places where there is pure devotional energy, as distinct from the unfocused and haphazard energy of a commercial enterprise. For this purpose, the ancient Chinese even remolded the shape of the countryside and thereby made their world itself a more perfect reflection of heavenly values. Isn't that interesting? They would move the world. See, we tend to pendulum swing because there has been, and is increasingly so, total disregard for the harmony of the natural world, the wisdom of the natural world, the inspiration of the devas, the necessity to give back to the earth, to respect the earth. All of a sudden, it becomes, don't touch it. Just to touch it is to do the wrong thing. But that's quite different than cooperating with the devas to make something beautiful, because human beings can bring into a situation many values. When Swamiji was working on building Crystal Hermitage, and there was a certain amount of kerfuffle within the community because he brought in truckloads of dirt. He created a flat area where he could put the back garden. This is part of how he used the inheritance he got from his parents. He thinned out trees so that there would be a more expansive vista. And I think somewhere in this book we find this. Swami talks about after we finished, there were so many more birds, such a different variety of birds, the whole vibration of the place from when it was just his dome, just perched on the edge of this completely unkept area, and when it became this beautiful, harmonious garden with the tulips and the ponds and the flowering trees. It would be very hard to say that steep slope with untended forest, was actually more pleasing. To whom would it have been more pleasing? It was an alternative, but was it really more pleasing, even in a divine sense, or even in terms of the natural world? Swami said his own experience living there was that the atmosphere, even among the natural creatures, elevated rather than the opposite. So he says, wilderness alone, especially unkempt wilderness, attracts rakshasas. Rakshasas are demons, dark. The rakshasas are always the enemy in the Indian epics. The rakshasas are the demons are the right word for it. And lower entities. Angels are attracted to places that reflect the higher regions where they live. Now think about it. Whenever we think of the astral world, which is really the model for this world, you might have, extraordinarily natural vistas, but they're not chaotic. There's always a harmony to it. Even in what we love in the natural world is the harmony. Swami doesn't say it here, but it's written in this other letter whenever we find it. He says, in every fairy tale, the wicked witch always lives in the middle of some terribly unkempt forest. And it's like even in our literature, we have this where the vines are overgrown and the dead limbs are piled here and the ground is full of stubble and we can hardly walk. And then way in there you have the wicked witch's cottage, because we instinctively know that that kind of an atmosphere is the home for the rakshasas. And then when you create an atmosphere that's more heavenly, then the heavenly beings want to be there. And if you're in the astral world and you can create with your own thoughts whatever you want to create, even if it's natural, so to speak, it always, you just instinctively, this is what Swami says to this woman, a person of your refinement and your sense of beauty, that's what you're going to want. And this is where he goes back to say the problem is how you're defining this. The word park-like might have been used, but to then say park-like versus wilderness, what is it that we really want? And so this project did go forward. God put man in charge of the earth that he might bring divine consciousness to whatever he touches. And there's that fact. God put man in charge of the earth. And these are the things, again, these were the challenging ideas. You just say that, and you say, well, yes or no, but it is what the Bible says, and it is also what Master said. Master said that man is a special creation and is in charge of earth because the human body is more evolved, because the human body has the capacity, has a highly developed nervous system to perceive infinity. And it's not that the lower animals are not valued by the infinite, but as the jiva inside those animal bodies evolves, it gradually evolves in consciousness to the point where it needs a human body to express its full potential. And so mankind, with the capacity for conscious divine realization, then has this responsibility to turn back to the earth itself, to the plants and the animals, and to uplift them, to draw them upward. That's part of how we serve. Now, mankind desecrates the divine within him when, instead of serving the planet, the life forms that we came through to become human, we just exploit them. Then we are betraying our responsibility. But nonetheless, that responsibility is still in our hands. So we have a job to do. Lahiri Mahashaya, they say, was working on a means where animals could be liberated, where you could advance much more through an animal body. I'm stopping for a moment because there was some important clarification on that, which I can no longer remember. So I'll just have to leave it until I can remember that more clearly. But it is an important part of being a human, is to help those behind us on the consciousness evolution scale to come forward. It's very good karma for animals to be human pets, because in association with human beings, their own evolution is highly quickened, because they're constantly in an atmosphere where higher vibrations and higher thoughts and much expanded opportunities are open to them. There is a great deal to be said for, not confining or limiting, not taking away the opportunities of an animal incarnation. But living in the wild is a lot more challenging than being domesticated, because you have to always feed yourself. You're always in danger of needing to eat or being eaten. I remember Bharat, who is the author of Sharing Nature with Children and a whole series of other books, the Earth Sky Foundation. He's a world-renowned nature educator, is Joseph Cornell, his English name. And I remember him talking. Now, it might have been his wife, Ananda, now that I think about it, but one or the other of them was talking to us, and they were talking about rabbits. And they were talking about the problem with being a rabbit is that everything else wants to eat you. And he was just talking about, the incredible stress that it is to be a rabbit, because whenever you're out anywhere, somebody's going to be looking for you to make you into dinner. And when I've seen nature films and so on, which I do sometimes, and you see, and the film is about, let me just try to think about how you would, the film is about like an undersea creature, a dolphin or a whale or something that eats seals. And so it's always trying to be able to get the baby seal to eat it. And when you're watching the movie from the point of view of what eats the baby seal, you're really happy when your creature gets dinner. Of course, if you're watching the movie from the point of view of the mother seal, you're terribly upset when whatever it is gets to eat the baby. But who's to say which is which? This is just what it is to live in an animal body. These are tricky incarnations for all of this. A friend of mine had a very vivid dream, which I think he felt it was real. It certainly seemed real, in which he was a bear, a big brown bear. And he said he had just basically 3 states of consciousness. It was a very vivid dream. He was either hungry and desperately looking for food, he was afraid because something else was going to eat him, or he was sound asleep. He said it was an interesting life, but not totally, not really a thrilling one. But mankind comes in and can influence things in a wholly different direction, can uplift the consciousness of the creatures that mankind associates with, can shift the environment of the creatures, providing appropriate food, appropriate natural balance, just if mankind acts, and this is where Swami says, God put man in charge of the earth that he might bring divine consciousness to whatever he touches. If he fails, as he does, unfortunately, all too frequently, he does not bring to fruition his own God-given destiny. Man's sensitivity has been given him by God to refine and develop material reality. That's an interesting statement, isn't it? Man's sensitivity has been given to him by God in order that man can refine and develop his material reality. In other words, we're supposed to participate. We're not supposed to just let it run on its own, because we bring to it, I'm speaking as humanity, we bring to it the potential for a superior, more refined understanding. God needs channels of his blessings on earth. It is not his way to want us to say, you do it all, Lord. It's your business, not mine. Just as a close, I will repeat that wonderful joke that Swami used to love to tell. The priest is visiting the farmer, and the priest is, praising the farmer's accomplishments, saying, well, look what you and God were able to do. Look at the field you and God were able to clear. Look at the barn you and God were able to raise. Look at the pond that you and God were able to create. And finally, the farmer just couldn't stand it. He said, that may be true, Father, but you should have seen this place when God had it all to himself. And in the context of this letter, that's exactly what Swami's saying. And we all understand that joke, don't we? So this is where this whole discussion that Swami's putting forward in this letter challenges us. If we really understand that joke, then what happens when we're going to manage our forest to get desperately needed income that will result in a healthier forest after we do it? Like, where are the lines? This is the great fun of, a book like this, because it brings up so many subjects that allow us to refine our own understanding. So, my friends, God bless you.